Hello and welcome to a very special edition of It's Not That Simple. We are filming this episode in front of a live audience in central Lisbon. Climate change is the biggest challenge humanity is facing. That's not my opinion, it's the opinion of the vast majority of guests that we've had on this show over the last couple of years. But of course, it's not the first time that we as humans are facing phenomena and threats from the climate. It's happened throughout history. And we've had to adapt the way we've lived as a result. Today, the planet is changing, and that is precisely the topic of this show today, planet and its change. And we're going to be discussing it with our special guest, our star guest who's here with us today, Peter Frankopan. Peter, I could go on about your CV for quite a few paragraphs, I would say. Let's just summarize it and say, of course, that you're a professor of global history at Oxford University. You're also a senior fellow research fellow at Worcester College. You're a world-renowned author, as well as being a historian. You shot to worldwide fame, I think it'd be fair to say, with your book, The Silk Roads in 2015.
I was very famous at home.
And I hope you still are.
Well, no, I've become less famous with my children. But anyway, sorry.
It's okay. Now you've got another bestseller for the last year. This book has won a variety of awards. Earth Transformed, an Untold History. And of course, you look at the history of the planet and humanity from a very different perspective, which is the evolution of the climate, so many of the threats we've faced before. So my first question has to be, what kind of solutions did humanity manage to find in order to overcome so many of these challenges historically?
Well, thank you, Pedro, and thank you to the Foundation for hosting me in real life rather than online. So it's a real pleasure to be back in this beautiful city. I'm also incredibly grateful that the draw for the Euros put Portugal tomorrow night playing rather than tonight. Otherwise, I suspect it might be just you and me, and you wouldn't be happy to be here. So thank you.
Accurate.
Thank you. Well, do you want I suppose I can give you good news answers. I give you bad news answers. The bad news answer: how did we adapt? For almost all human history, we didn't adapt. We died out. Settler colonies that left Africa tens of thousands of years ago, most of them went to places that they couldn't sustain life, and that was it. Most of human experience is failure. And sometimes we over-focus on the things that work. And it's businesses are like that, restaurants are like that. It's the things that don't work that are probably more in the majority. So I suppose when you look at when things do work, a lot of that, unfortunately, is probably also still bad news, which is good luck. Sometimes it's not about making smart decisions, it's about being lucky and surviving. So if you take history, I mean, my book, I cover 4.5 billion years.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what the sale price is here in Portugal, but if it's about 30 euros or so, my publisher sitting in front of the row, 40 euros, 50, 60? Oh my God, thank God. What, 25 euros? 25 euros. So it's €1 per 500 million years, right? So if you can find a better deal than that at anywhere in Lisbon, please let me know. When you go back to the beginning of human history, and a lot depends on when you think our species really becomes distinct. But if you go back about 100,000 years, a lot depends on chance, but a lot depends on the impulses of why you move and how you set things up in the first place. But we don't have the capacity in that tiny little time frame to adapt biologically. Our ancestors, if we were sitting here 30,000 years ago, would have been much the same as you and me, maybe not quite so well dressed and so well groomed. But those changes in our species don't happen quickly. So our ability to adapt mean about our ability to come up with solutions that solve problems. And one thing that is very good about us as a species is that we are very good at problem solving when we're in groups. That's one reason why communities start to grow and start to differentiate between different tasks. And we're very good at passing on knowledge to future generations. So one of the reasons we've done well, I suppose, in the past, going back into deep time, is the resilience to kind of keep on going and to keep telling ourselves it's worth it rather than giving up. So that's not a particularly good answer for what we do for the 21st century, as here in Portugal, some of the expectations are that global summer temperatures in Lisbon will be 8 degrees higher than it is today. And that poses lots of different kinds of questions. Science and technology will play a role. If you can air condition, and if you can air condition in a way that doesn't make the climate even hotter by not using fossil fuels, then you could be fine indoors. But at those temperatures, you can't be productive outside, and there's a risk to life.
But when you look back in time and you try to identify really the biggest challenges that we faced, how difficult was that, and how much did you learn, and what was the biggest insight that you took from that you weren't expecting? Because this is a different perspective when you look back at history, right? So
it's so hard. It's so nice to come and give these talks, but to get the balance of sounding both modest, but also not, but also show off a bit. So it's hard.
You can show off.
Well, I mean, what did I learn? Well, last time we spoke was in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I'd been working on pandemic diseases and their risks and threats for quite a while before I wrote the book. It's one of the reasons that pandemics play such an important role. Zoonotic disease jumps from animals into human human form. Zoonosis has been the biggest killer of all. Things like smallpox, measles, all these diseases that have come from animals, coronaviruses too, leprosy, etc., are extremely dangerous. I mean, smallpox alone killed 300 million people in the 150 years before it was eradicated in 1977. So I was invited into number 10 Downing Street to come and advise the government in Britain about what the next 10 years, the threats and opportunities were. And I said, the only thing I'm worried about is global pandemics and the lack of global response. Right? When something goes wrong, are there systems set up that allow people to share information quickly and to put up screens and walls in the same way that populations did in Venice and Lisbon and Constantinople hundreds of years ago? And the idea that people, a millennium ago had better responses to pandemic disease than we did, it's pretty sobering. So what did I learn? I learned that when I told the government that we should prepare for a pandemic and that someone in the room across Whitehall would have to decide in the next 10 years, when would we close airspace? Who counts as a primary care worker? How do you get food to people in the houses if they're locked down? How do you have nursing facilities? How do you have bed care? How do you have PPE and syringes and things like that? What surprised me was that the day that I gave that talk was the day Wuhan told Beijing there was a problem. I then wrote about it. It was put on the front cover of Prospect magazine, where the editor said, there's no way this is ever going to happen in the next 10 years. And I said, okay, if it doesn't happen in 10 years' time, or 31st of January, 2029, I'll buy the beer. Plus, no one will remember. And if people accuse me saying I was wrong, I'll say maybe in the next 10 years. And the day that came out in print was the day Beijing told the World Health Organization there was a problem. So what I learned was that if you ask in the right questions at the right time, you can get the timing lucky, but I'm particularly interested in how vulnerable global networks are, trade networks, ecosystems. And we have a game in England, I don't know if you have it in Portugal, it was called Kaplunk. You have lots of straws with marbles in the sort of glass tower, and everyone had to pull out a straw one by one until the marbles start to fall through. And it feels to me that we've taken quite a few of those out, and that there are lots of reasons to be positive, but the warning signs are pretty severe at the moment. So I think we should be thinking around hierarchies of what to prepare for, and difficulties also are sometimes a good thing. They're the mother of all invention, necessity, the mother of all invention. So we can learn a lot from past experiences.
I think what we saw in the pandemic, in my opinion, is something which is my greatest fear when dealing with any kind of global crisis, which is the lack of cooperation. Politically, it seems that the world is becoming increasingly polarized. So the fact that let's all get together and pull through doesn't really seem like an option to work it out, even if the life of the planet or the life of humanity as we know it on this planet is at stake. When you look at this geopolitical dynamic that we live in at the moment, and then you try to get together, whether it's science, whether it's technology, whether it's insight, know-how, we can't really be that confident that the great superpowers can solve this together, right?
Well, leadership isn't that hard. It's not that difficult to explain what the problem is and to come up with solutions. Unfortunately, we're at a particular moment in time where we have simplistic problems being identified that are more or less non-existent, and they get used to extend individual power. I mean, so for example, I've been doing a lot on migration recently. 85% of all refugees and migrants live in the country next door to where they come from, because most people want to live near where their family are from, in similar ecosystems and so on. We think in the West that the world is all on the move. But compared to 1960, about 3% of the world's population were classed as migrant or refugees. Today, it's exactly the same, 3%. It's just that there are more of us, so it feels like it's a bigger problem. But I think the misidentification of issues is because we want simple answers and we don't have the patience and tolerance. I don't think that's because of education or new technologies. I think it's just that people who speak with great confidence about how they can solve things can sound very attractive. And we probably didn't do a very good job in history faculties explaining that, because otherwise we wouldn't be having the rise of either hard left or hard right. Most normal people, I think, would want to be somewhere in the middle, hear both sides of an argument and go, well, I can see both points of view, can't we split the difference? Rather than the kind of populist things that we see at the moment. But for what it's worth, we in Britain, with Brexit and things like that, we probably are good at one thing, apart from making crisps. We're very good at being ahead of the trend, generally, in terms of fashion and music and things like that. And it could be our drift towards the right, which now all of Europe is following. We've now got over that in the UK, and it looks like in a couple of weeks at the election, there's going to be a swing very hard away from far-right parties, or at least in terms of the numbers of votes that get translated into parliamentary seats. Whereas, we were just saying, I'd have thought the chances of a far-right prime minister sitting alongside Macron at the Paris Olympics are extremely high. Here in Portugal, with Chega on the move, maybe not so great didn't do so well in the elections, the European elections, but lots of the mood feels to me that lots of people recognise there are problems, and we're all searching for someone who can give us answers. And the first wave of answers that people want to listen to are things that are very simple. Stop the boats, deport people to Rwanda, leave the European Union. All sounds easy. In fact, in all those cases, probably make things worse rather than better. But I don't think that our capacity to work together is bad. I think that there's plenty of leadership globally.
Globally? Okay.
Yeah, I think there's lots of, parts of the world I work on, people are very positive about the future. Here in Europe, we're chronically depressed, and maybe there are good reasons for that. But in most parts of the world, people feel that the world for their children and grandchildren will be better than for them. And that energy and optimism drives innovation, cooperation, collaboration, and investment. I think if you're scared, you make defensive decisions, and often those are poor ones. I'm talking like I'm a politician. I'm a historian, so I can tell you how that maps back to the past. But I'm not here to tell you to vote for me. But we should probably think a bit harder about what kind of representatives we want to be making policies and which ones matter.
I think it's difficult to be positive when we have so many conflicts that are affecting crucial relationships when it comes to the dynamics between the world's superpowers. I mean, when you look at the situation in Ukraine, firstly, when Russia seems to have natural resources where it can continue to fund a military campaign there, it has the support of China. Where do you see this going, Peter? And for how long do you see it going? Both from the Russian side and the support, financial and military support that Ukraine continues to get.
Well, I probably have to choose my words reasonably carefully. I think that, I guess taking a longer run at the answer, some of us felt that the Cold War never ended. That the dissolution of the Soviet Union, if you knew the Soviet Union, if you've traveled into Central Asia, the Caucasus, this is not a Russia that woke up 2 years ago with an invasion of Ukraine. This is an entity that has functioned and behaved the same way for at least 20 years. Maybe you can make the case that 98, the collapse of the ruble, collapse of the Russian economy, at that point where all Russian businesses more or less were put into the hands of about 30 individuals. Maybe that was a break point rather than 91 and the collapse. But it's the same people in charge. Putin's been there ever since. Lavrov's been there ever since. Patrushev's been there ever since. It's the same people, the same language, the same way of doing things. So I don't think Russia has changed. I think we fooled ourselves here in the West into what we were dealing with, and that's the same with China. We fooled ourselves on that. We fooled ourselves about social media companies and technologies. We fooled ourselves about climate. We fooled ourselves about lots of things. And I think that we should probably take quite a long think about how we educate young people, because again, I don't think we're doing a good enough job on giving them the tools to understand the world around us. Where does it go? Well, you know, I have a probably slightly different view to the mainstream. I think that the Russians believe the momentum is with them, which was not the case last summer. In the spring, in May and June last year, people in Moscow were really worried that the Ukrainians would break through and that might have a domino effect onto Russian economy and politics. There was maybe a moment where if Ukraine had been given more weapons at the right time and so on, and the right kinds of weapons, that might have concentrated Russia's mind. I don't think there's any prospect at the moment at all for Russia to think about a negotiation. But, you know, with 350,000 casualties on the Russian side, you know, you do start to drain the provinces and, you know, the Kalmyk and the Buryats and minorities in Russia. You need to recruit from closer to home. That becomes more difficult. Probably 8% of Russian GDP is going on a war that no Russian really understands what benefits there are. You know, apart from hurting Ukraine, you know, the territory and there's nothing that has any particular strategic or military value. And so Putin will keep on going. That might change if later on this year things start to move forward. That might change things, but it's a question for Ukraine about whether and when they're willing to offer terms. But I think everybody in Kiev takes the view, rightly, that whatever ceasefire, stalemate, or freeze happens, the Russians will almost certainly go back, regroup, re-strengthen, and then come back again. So it's how do you find a defense mechanism? I mean, the United States, United Kingdom, and Russia had guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine in the Budapest Memorandum in 1994. You know, just before, 6 months before Russia invaded Ukraine, Putin wrote an essay called on the historical unity of the Russians and Ukrainian people, which he signs off at the end saying, we never had a problem with the Ukrainians, we would certainly never use force, it's up to the Ukrainians to choose their own destiny, but we're brothers. You know, since that point, you know, you see how they've treated Ukraine. So I don't think there's a quick fix. I think in the West we need to concentrate our minds to work out, are we supporting Ukraine because we think it's in our national interests and it's our national security that's at stake, or are we helping Ukraine because we feel sorry for what's happening for them? And those discussions, there's not perhaps as much clarity of thought in some NATO countries as there are in others. But on the eastern flank of Europe, you know, there's a lot of anxiety about what's happening and how things might get much worse. You know, Radek Sikorski, Foreign Minister of Poland, he says you have a choice, either Russian tanks on Ukraine's border or on Poland's border. So, you know, it'll keep on going until one or both sides are exhausted. And my guess is that the West would outrun the Russians.
Okay. And I wanted to ask you how this conflict can affect the relationship between the US, West, and China, and all the implications that can have from a trade perspective and a financial perspective as well.
I think it's broadly irrelevant.
Okay.
I mean, we make a lot about it here in the West, in think tanks, talking about the alliance of China and Russia. There's something there, but much less than we normally perceive. I mean, the Chinese are fairly risk-averse, don't really want to get involved. Okay. They've been quite careful in trying to give Russia some support, but they haven't gone as far as they could have done. They've exploited the position economically with Russia to their advantage. And you know, they played their cards, I'd have thought, in a not a completely surprising way. You know, quite. You know, if you're Chinese, seeing it from their point of view, reasonably sensibly. But you know, lots of people have done really well from the war in Russia. You know, Indian government is powering an economy on subsidized Russian energy in return for silence or abstention at the UN and elsewhere. You know, this is a great moment if you're a Mercedes-Benz dealer in Tbilisi or Central Asia, and the Germans are busy exporting as much as they can to get into Russian markets. So, you know, if you want to get your Bentley serviced in downtown Moscow, there's no impact on whatsoever. And I think we in the West have been pretty slow to close some of those trapdoors.
Okay.
But I think the China stuff is of course very important for the US side, and a lot will depend on what happens in the US election in November.
Perfect link into my next question, actually. because as someone who lived in the United States for nearly a decade and have followed American politics quite closely, I'm incredibly worried about the outcome of the election in November. How worried are you, and how much is at stake here when it comes to the decision that such a polarized country is going to make in a few months' time?
Yeah, there have got to be better people than me to ask, I think, about that. I don't know is the answer. I mean, I think that fear is not a great, being optimistic or pessimistic is not always useful to let yourself be emotional. I think it's trying to work out what the specific consequences are either which way around, particularly with China.
Right.
But a lot will depend on who wins, in what way, who they appoint to their cabinet, whether those appointees get through the Senate, it's probably not optimal to have the world's greatest military power and probably the world's greatest nuclear power, who is able to launch nuclear weapons without needing to go to Congress to ask for permission to do so, or with a mental health test before doing so. So these are the revisions of what should normally be done to try to make sure that there are brakes on powers like that have not been put in place. And let's hope there aren't consequences. But Trump, in some ways, was not completely irrational when he was president. I mean, for what it's worth, and I'm not here to betray my own political views or allegiances, Biden has put more tariffs on China than Trump did. He's allowed more oil and gas pipelines than Trump did. He's stopped more immigrants getting into the United States than Trump did. And there's a lot more similarity between policies, but he's built more of the wall than Trump did. There's a lot of similarities, I think, between how these things work. So it's important to not just play the man, as we'd say in football, but to play the ball. So it's not just about Biden and Trump, it's about the infrastructure that sits underneath them. And, by and large, no one in America particularly wants a war, nor do they want a civil war. So, one would assume that won't happen. But it doesn't take much for the butterfly's wings to flap, and then the world we live in changes.
We mentioned that in Europe we've had the rise of populism and the far right. How serious is that threat to the continent's ability and the EU's ability to be a major player internationally and compete with China, with the United States?
Look, we're in a country where you have a military dictatorship, right? So having 50 Chega MPs is probably not that bad. Right? It might not feel great around the dinner table in central Lisbon, but a lot of countries in Europe have experienced a lot worse than people saying that they don't believe in climate change or saying that we should deport migrants. We're a long way away from what proper fascist totalitarian systems look like, which was part of Europe for most of the 20th century. So I think that we have to believe that democracy works. We have to believe that people, when they vote, might make a mistake and they might change their mind, but they get a chance 4 years' time to vote for somebody different. And we'll see, maybe that's Macron's genius master plan, is to allow the right or the far right to have the reins of power in France, and maybe they mess everything up. I mean, arguably, Meloni, who everyone was worried about, has actually been quite a good political leadership for Italy, has moved away from some of the positions that she took in public before she became prime minister, has been quite good on Ukraine, has been quite good on lots of different things. And in fact, from the Roman point or Italian point of view, you see France going through a transition of difficulty, Catalonia and Spain being looking like it might disintegrate, Schulz more or less dead man walking. Things they can resolve themselves, and the best thing that we live in a world where we are free to express our opinions differently, and we've got to be quite careful not to try to say this is like the 1930s, or that whichever leader we don't like is like Hitler, because that scale of differential of genocide and of mass persecution and of euthanasia, that's not the world that we live in. And, we might get there, but I don't think we're that close.
Okay. But when you talk about Europe and its place and influence in global politics and the increase in fragmentation in the kind of rhetoric across the board throughout the continent. I mean, you look at Europe, and I know you've referenced this in your books. I mean, not even our football clubs do we really own anymore, where they've been sold or purchased by states or by countries that really don't have a history in the game. So when you talk about Europe's place in the dynamic of global politics, it doesn't concern you that it feels like wherever you look, we can't really get it together.
Look, I can't go back in time and imagine what it was like living in, what's now Angola or Mozambique or Sri Lanka when the Portuguese arrived. But I imagine people's reactions are very similar, which is like, we don't know who these guys are. They've got a lot of money. They're buying all of our best assets. And we feel very uncomfortable about it. But you have to either adapt or get on with it. Investors don't need to sell to Saudi Arabian Sovereign Wealth Fund if you own Newcastle. But most people want to sell to the best, the highest offer. And if you have wealth, why not? If you believe in capitalism, and I know what the alternatives are, then probably we should be a bit more relaxed about some of those things. High levels of investment drives innovation and entrepreneurship and so on, can have good outcomes. So I do think that and I have written about that much though I love Lisbon and Madrid and Paris and Berlin and London, the decisions made in those, and Rome, etc., the decisions made in those cities are probably less significant today than ones made in places like Moscow or Beijing or Delhi, and even states that are more peripheral that we don't ever spend time talking about, like Malaysia, which is in the process of becoming the primary Silicon Valley of Southeast Asia, or Indonesia, the largest Muslim country on earth. When you start to put together Indonesia, Philippines, Bangladesh, Pakistan, you're at 1 billion people, and most people in a room like this don't know the name of, forget about footballer, any sportsman, film star, leader.
True.
These are parts of the world that we've turned our back to because we, I suppose, think we're culturally and economically superior. And we have the nerve to say, when people wealthy who've come from making their fortunes in supermarkets or data cables or whatever in these parts of the world come and buy properties in Lisbon or football clubs, and we say you're the wrong kind of person for us, I feel much more comfortable with someone with blonde and blue eyes doing it. That takes me back to a much more darker, difficult place that Europe's been in, rather than go out, innovate, compete, build businesses, find the best, educate the best possible way, and become global. But I think we in Europe, and Portugal's slightly different because you still have more global connections than most countries in Europe. But young people need to go out and explore the world. They need to go and see in what ways are people different. Do people in the streets of Chennai or Mumbai, do they listen to the same music that we do? How come everybody in Shanghai can tell you who Tom Cruise is or Cristiano Ronaldo or whoever?
Good pronunciation.
Thank you. Who else can I think of? Rui Costa. People recognize our Taylor Swift. We can recognize all these Western figures, but we've invested precisely zero in thinking about other people's histories. And at some point, that's a dignity question, an equality question when you sit across the table. And it also is it's also a point of disadvantage. If you're talking and negotiating with someone who knows a lot more about you than you do about them, then things are tricky. And that's felt very keenly in places like China and Russia, the Gulf, where people have invested in learning English, learning about cucumber sandwiches, looking at the ways in which we do things. And we're busy looking at our own reflection in the mirror, sort of complaining about the fact the world is changing.
Talking about the difference in perspectives, though, and with the extensive travel that you have done throughout your life and career, the conversations you've had with many leaders across the world, do you feel governments and cultures and societies are as worried about climate change as we are here in the West? What kind of conversations do you have with them there? And regarding the urgency to make changes, because obviously a lot of those countries are in completely different changes of the process of evolution, from utilizing natural resources, from a technological standpoint as well. So what do you notice over there? And if you say that so many of these decisions that are made in other parts of the world are so important, how are those decisions looking like when it comes to climate and the planet?
Well, again, I mean, maybe I've got the room wrong, and you're much more knowledgeable about some of the parts of the world that I'll mention. But we had about 200,000 people displaced by floods in Kazakhstan 6 weeks ago. That's a lot of people to be moved by apocalyptic floods that are kind of once in a 2,000-year moment. In 22, Pakistan had catastrophic floods that did make the news in lots of places in the world. They had population displaced of between 8 and 9 million people. About 30 million livestock died. single cow, single sheep. It's, in some cases, a family's only asset. So countries like that, my friend Sherry Rahman, who is Minister of Climate Change, how worried was she? She's absolutely petrified, because these things, when they come round, catch countries unprepared. We know that there's a lot of research done around how climate shocks make governments more centralized. They strengthen authoritarianism, because when you have to have a whole of government response to a flood or drought, then the government takes more powers, and governments that take more powers tend to not give them up again. So countries in the Caribbean, countries in South Pacific, countries that have had significant single events that have been catastrophic, places like Bangladesh, where low-lying land, places like Vietnam, where 20% of the land is likely to be underwater in the next 15 years. Those countries are absolutely, I wouldn't say terrified. They're trying to work out how they can best respond. And those responses are partly, how do you mitigate, how do you prevent? Some is things that I'm a bit involved in some cases, is about what kind of disaster planning do you need?
Right.
So, for example, in places like Pakistan, you need to train your first responders how to save people from floods. Here in Lisbon, you're all worried about an earthquake coming again one day, but it's what kinds of new threats require different kinds of responses. In some parts of southern Europe, I don't know Portugal, the southern part of Portugal well enough, but we've established, new diseases, emerging infectious diseases become established in the Mediterranean in the last 18 months that mean that you need to train your doctors in a different way to recognize malaria, to recognize Zika, to recognize dengue, to recognize hemorrhagic fevers. And that's about saying, well, we don't just, we're trained in hospitals, as a young medic. You need to be learning about things that the generation before you weren't prepared for. So that there are lots of ways in which you can use the anxieties and, I suppose, fears to plan ahead, to understand where those shocks come from. But, we haven't all been dealt an equal hand in life. Climate change is going to be great for Russia, unfortunately. Climate change is going to be great for a place like Canada. But if you're in the tropics, then water becomes a problem. If you're in water-stressed parts of the world, like China, then it becomes a problem. If you're in parts of the world where the disease envelope changes, then there's a problem. But there are other parts of the world where things are not looking so bad. But here in Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, again, apocalyptic floods that are kind of once in a 2,000-year event. Yesterday in Florida, again, it's measured on the sigma. These things shouldn't happen. Historically, we have the data that shows they shouldn't happen. The amount of rainfall that's fallen in Sarasota overnight is the greatest downpour that region's had for millennia. And so you could be worried about it. You can buy an umbrella. You can stock up on water. But probably more systemic thinking around what is the world not going to be like in 10 years' time? What's it like now?
But I was wondering, from a policy standpoint, if countries like India, Russia, China really have climate crisis at the forefront of their agenda when they have so many other spinning plates.
Well, so for example, a friend of mine who's genius, young woman who's in charge of some of the Uzbekistan climate response, has geo-mapped every single school, every single hospital to be able to establish water resources, electricity needs, so that in the point of crisis, there's an ability to cope. Green transitions are working pretty effectively in some parts of the world. China installed more renewables in the first 6 months of last year than the United States in the whole of its history. And the United States is moving quite fast like that too. So on Friday last week, the United States produced 50% of its energy needs through either nuclear or renewable. First time ever in history. So there's lots going on, and lots of it's quite good news, but some of the bad news is really bad. But investing in long-term strategies is expensive, but it's probably less expensive than to have to deal with it at real speed. So I think there are places where those accelerations are happening quite fast, but I'm not just worried about warming and climate. It's also about water quality, air pollution. Here in Portugal, 5 times more people die per year because of air quality or poor air quality than in car accidents. And if I want to drive a car in Lisbon, I need to have a license, I need to have lessons, I need to have a car with airbags, I need to have insurance, I need to follow the stop and go, I have the lights, the speed limits, huge restrictions, quite rightly, to protect us, seat belts. But the air quality legislation in Portugal, like in every other country in Europe, is very poor. And if you're told 5 times more people die from air pollution, we all have a shorter life expectancy, even in this room, measured in days. If you have respiratory diseases, if you're immunocompromised, it's taking years off your life, then probably you should think we should be asking our political leaders to come up with policies that save lives. And we do better now than we did 30 years ago, but not enough.
Last question before we move into our quick fire. From the extensive work you did, especially from your latest book, Earth Transformed, what was the most important learning that you took that shapes a message that you can have for us today regarding what we've learned from the planet and what we need to do as a collective race in order to deal with the hand that we are going to be dealt in the decades to come?
That's an easier one.
Okay.
It's a great question. The joy of studying the past, that is what education is for. And we think of education, you do it at school, then you finish university. Life is all about acquiring new skills, new knowledge, new information, new ways of doing things. And what I hope with a book like mine, because it's sort of panoramic and it's kaleidoscopic in what it's trying to cover everything, it gives you a chance to see how incredibly exciting it is to be alive at this time. I'm the first generation of historian that could ever write a book like this because of the new tools that we have. Maybe I'll say something more like that with Joanna, but I think it teaches us all that there is a real benefit in learning and learning systematically about things. And if you can do that, then you can start to ask maybe better questions that affect us all individually. We don't always have to think about who we're going to vote for and expect our leaders to do things. It's what does this mean for us ourselves? So, I had no idea before I started writing my book that my linen shirt requires 2,500 litres of water, which is the same as an adult drinking water for 3 years. Right? So that changes the way in which I think about what I need. Thinking about which kinds of food substances are more energy intensive and more water intensive, I'll make a better decision if I'm better educated. And we, who are professional educators in universities like mine, we need to share that kind of knowledge, and ideally with audiences who buy books for €1 per, I think it's actually 300 million years. So I've oversold the value for money without doing my mathematics. But the more you can be informed, the better decisions that you can make for the future. And I think that's quite a reassuring thing to think about. And that's the way that my book's been received, actually. It's sort of people ask me about the future, and I keep telling them I can't tell them about the future, but I can tell them about the past. And that the better informed they are, then maybe they would have a better answer than the future than I would.
Okay, quick fire time.
Yeah.
4 questions left, so in one word or one sentence.
Yeah.
Right? What is one personality trait that a good leader could really benefit from having?
That's being brave enough to make a decision, and then being brave enough to realize they made a bad one.
Second one, I think, is pretty clear, especially with this topic that we're discussing today, but biggest challenge humanity faces?
Oh, that's a long list.
What's at the top of that list?
Probably climate is up there, but that's not what keeps me awake at night at the moment. I think emerging infectious disease and nuclear proliferation, and also shock events that decouple all the stuff that we think is sensible. So interruption of food supply is my number one problem.
That could be a topic for a whole other conversation, surely.
Maybe even another book, yeah.
Yeah. If you could change one thing in the world by magic today, what would that be? Snap of the fingers.
Gosh, these are tricky questions. I'd make Spotify free.
And we would all applaud. What is the most?
I had to subscribe to Spotify because I had small kids at the time, and I don't know, maybe it was different in Portugal. Maybe I'd been profiled, but every advert that came on was about practicing safe sex. And when that comes on in the kitchen, when you're listening to Elvis Presley or Frank Sinatra or whatever it is, so I had to cough up. Yeah, but anyway, Spotify.
Finally, what's the most important learning of your life?
Keep learning, and the joy and the beauty of trying to think about how much we can learn around us if we open our minds to think about the world in wider geographic, chronological, thematic ways. It's unlimited the rewards you get. So I mean, I'm a tiny bit older than you, Pedro, but I compare it to the bit in The Wizard of Oz where it goes from black and white into Technicolor. Mm-hmm. That world which we can look at the past and at the present in these incredibly exciting ways. it's a wonder. It really is, and we should celebrate wonders rather than always be worried.
Peter, we've talked about a lot over the last 40 minutes or so. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, your expertise with us. It's clear the planet continues to change in many more ways than just one. And thank you for enlightening us on all the work that you've done historically to help us understand this rock we live on.
Thanks, Peter.
And what we can do to help make sure that it stays here for as long as possible. Thank you so much. Fantastic edition of It's Not That Simple. Thank you.